I played 100 matches of Edison Format Yu-Gi-Oh! And here is my take on the whole war of the formats. I think that Edison Format shows the flaws in Goat Format, and I think Goat Format shows the flaws in Edison Format. And I'm going to talk about both of those sets of flaws because they're really in two completely different groups, and then talk more about the solution. So I'm going to start off first with my criticisms of Edison Format, which I know all of the Edison Format fans will not like, but here I go. So my issue with Edison Format as a whole, and this is somewhat an issue of preference, so you of course maybe have different preferences than me. I sort of put Yu-Gi-Oh! On this spectrum as far as how the game plays out, and the spectrum is the classic old school era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Versus the modern new school era of Yu-Gi-Oh! And depending on which of those two styles you want to play, that obviously is going to totally shape your preferences as far as format. And what's the difference between classic and modern Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, in classic Yu-Gi-Oh, card advantage really matters a lot, whereas in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it's all about strong board positions, right? The emphasis of setups, right? Not so much, oh, I have 2 more cards than you, I'm ahead. It might be like, oh, I have a Stardust Dragon and a Royal Oppression, so I'm ahead. So that's one difference. The other difference that I find, and one of the really big reasons that I like Goat Format, is that classic Yu-Gi-Oh has these in-game sort of micro decisions centered around tactics and trade-offs. So in Goat Format, it might be the decision of, oh, am I going to set Dekochi turn 1, or am I going to set Gravekeeper Spy? There are pros and cons to both. Or it might be like, hey, am I going to set a Mirror Force and maybe expose it to a breaker or hang on to it later? You know, or if I can deal with my opponent's monster with, say, Metamorphosis and 2000 Ice Restrict or Chaos Sorcerer, which one should I use now? Which one should I save for later? So I feel like these sort of micro decisions really shape out how the game plans out. Those decisions are more interesting, more complicated. This decision of, well, which card am I going to play on turn 5 can really shape how the game state looks on turn 20. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't really about those sort of tactical micro decisions. It's more about comboing off as hard and as quickly as possible. So a lot of this started during like the dad era, where it was like, oh, I want to make a board of, oh, you know, Stardust, Colossal Fighter, Royal Oppression, Solemn Judgment, and I just want to do that as quickly as possible because if I do, I'm gonna win. There's not really much of a sort of trade-off analysis there. It's sort of about speed and effectiveness rather than, again, weighing those sort of trade-offs between, oh, if I do this, I can't do this. There's a lot more sort of free card advantage and free board advantage in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And you're just kind of being wrong to not take that. As far as the deck building goes, there's subtle differences, but deck building in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a lot more centered around playing sort of like good cards, i.e. staples, and metagaming, right? So in Goat Format, it might be like, oh, do I want to play Mind Control or Zombire the Dark? Whereas deck building in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is all about like combo optimization, right? Again, going along with this idea of, oh, I just want to combo off as hard and as fast as possible. It's then, okay, well, how do I build my deck that sort of optimizes those probabilities of going off? And then the other difference is that in classic Yu-Gi-Oh, power cards were a lot less powerful, to be honest, in the sense that, like, in Goat Format, a power card goes +1, right? Like, people complain, like, oh my god, Pot of Greed, Delinquent Duo, they're way too good. And don't get me wrong, those cards would, of course, be great in modern Yu-Gi-Oh as well, but, like, the real power cards in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you know, having something that just goes +1 isn't really good enough, right? Like, I remember when Card D came out, it was just a free +1, and people had this view that, like, oh, this card is going to be broken. And in reality, like, just no one played it because it wasn't good enough. You know, it took up your normal summon, which was just too much. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, power cards go like +2 or more, +3, whatever, or they just win you the game. Like the classic example being Dark Arm Dragon. You know, Pot of Greed is a classic Yu-Gi-Oh card. Dark Arm Dragon is a modern Yu-Gi-Oh card, and those two cards are just totally different. So in that spectrum of classic Yu-Gi-Oh to modern Yu-Gi-Oh, first of all, both Goat Format and Edison Format, you can say, well, you know, in these situations, they have certain components of both. But Goat Format is a lot, I mean, it's basically just all classic Yu-Gi-Oh on that spectrum, right? It's about card advantage, tactics, finding +1s here and there. Whereas Edison Format, yes, I think you can say there are some elements of classic Yu-Gi-Oh in Edison Format, but on that spectrum, it's a lot closer to modern Yu-Gi-Oh. And I'm gonna elaborate on that, like, with this deck here, because I think this deck that I've played in Edison Format and had a very high win rate with is an example of why it's a lot closer to modern Yu-Gi-Oh. The best decks in Edison Format, there's the combo decks like this one, and then there's the anti-combo decks like Black Wings, and other decks too, like, to some extent, Gladiator Beasts are an anti-combo deck. Hero Beat is an anti-combo deck. Black Wings, in my opinion, are one of the best decks in Edison Format, but only because Black Wings are so good at dealing with decks like this. I will talk about why I think something along these lines is the most powerful deck in Edison Format. Now, most powerful doesn't mean best, by the way. It just means most powerful. But this is what I've been playing a lot, and I think this is the deck that's best in Edison ladder right now on Dueling Book, something very close to this. First of all, one of the main things that makes Edison Format a true modern Yu-Gi-Oh format rather than classic Yu-Gi-Oh is the existence of Substitute. And I think, like, a lot of people are just in denial about how powerful this card is. I posted a short before where people, I went off really hard with Substitute, and people were like, oh, that's like barely even good. And what makes Substitute so good? Well, if you can understand, like, why Chaos Turbo is good in Goat Format, then it's pretty easy to understand why Substitute is good in Edison Format. It has a very strong deck thinning component. People complain about Chaos Turbo and Goat Format, like, oh, Thunder Dragon, Upstart Goblin, Jar Greed, you just get to go through your deck so quickly, and then how do you lose when you see so much of your deck? Well, Substitute is just like that on crack. Think about it this way. Suppose you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh, and someone says, hey, I have this deck for you that I think you should play. And they say, this deck is good, but it's maybe not the best deck. There's one catch, though. If you play this deck, you can just play a 30-card deck. You can build this deck however you want, but you only need to play 30 cards in your main deck. Now, even though, like, that deck might not be something that you would play if, say, you had to play 40 cards, the fact that you only have to play 30 all of a sudden makes the deck broken. And that's what Substitute does. Substitute basically just lets you play a 30-card deck. That, combined with the fact that you can just get out 2 Dupe Frogs and make your board unattackable, basically gives a deck like this inevitability. Because it's like, oh, I'm playing a 30-card deck, you can't attack me, and eventually, like, I'm just gonna draw some combination of monsters that allow me to kill you. Basically, with this deck, your first priority is just to get a monster into play, summon Substitute, and just go through your whole deck, put all the monsters, frog monsters, in your grave. That is not hard, and one of the reasons that I like this list in comparison to other frog lists is the fact that we get to play Foolish Burial and 1-for-1, because these cards make Substitute way more consistent. Again, the deck building process, it's in line with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! We just have a combo that we're trying to do, and we're just trying to do that combo as much as possible. So we want to go Foolish into Dandelion, summon Substitute, tribute those tokens, go into 2 Dupe Frogs and a Swap Frog, return the Swap Frog to our hand, say go. Or just any random monster, right? Normal summon Raikou, 1-for-1 for Substitute, go through our deck, get 2 Dupe Frogs, say go. Now you might say, like, oh, 1-for-1, oh, that's a -1, or even something like special summon Quick Draw, go off with Substitute, oh, the Quick Draw is a -1. None of that matters. One of the big realizations when I came back to Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2016 was that, like, card advantage just did not matter anymore. It's just all about creating the most powerful, most impenetrable board. And I hate to say it, but, Edison Format is a lot more like 2016 than it is like 2005. Now, I think one of the most powerful cards in a Substitute deck is Pot of Avarice, because, again, inevitability. I'll have games where, I go off turn 1, do a bunch of stuff, end with 25 cards in deck, and, maybe my hand isn't that great. Maybe my hand is just like, I don't know, a Swap Frog, a Debris Dragon, an enemy controller, a Heavy Storm, whatever. And you might say, well, that doesn't look good. Well, I've ended my turn 1 with 25 cards in my deck, and 3 Pot of Avarices, which is essentially a Pot of Greed, and 3 Caiuses. And I know that, okay, well, 6 cards out of 25, that's basically a 1 in 4 chance every turn of drawing a power card. And the fact that we play 3 Avarice is the reason that we get to play only 3 Tribute Monsters. That's why we get to get away with doing that. One of the things that I realized pretty quickly, because I actually originally just started with, like, a straight-up Monarch deck, right? I was playing something like this. I, like, changed a couple cards a few times, but I started off playing this. I realized pretty quickly that like tribute monsters, yeah, sometimes they're good, but a lot of times they're just not, and you just lose because you have a handful of tribute monsters. Whereas this deck has a lot more options. Like if our opponent has a Masker Restrict in play, we don't just immediately lose. Or if I think my opponent has a Pulling the Rug set, I don't have to summon a Caius and just run it straight into their Pulling the Rug. The fact that we can both tribute summon and, synchro summon gives this deck tons of options. And there will be plenty of times where I'll have like 2 Caius in my hand and I'll just go 3 turns without summoning it because I have better plays to make. Like a lot of these Hero Frog decks, I'll see them playing like 3 Caius and 2 Ryza, or like 3 Caius and 2 Mobius. Or I've seen various Frogos play like 3 Caius and like 3 Light and Darkness Dragon. And it's like, yeah, you could do that, but it gives you a lot less flexibility. If you have any doubt that this deck is good, here's probably like the best argument. Now, of course, Edison Format was a bit different from the format immediately after when Shining Darkness was released, right? So when Shining Darkness was released, you basically had 3 top tier decks. You had Infernities, X-Sabers, and Frogs. And Frog, of course, was Frog FTK, but what people forget about Frog FTK is that Frog FTK, it had a transformation side, and it would either transformation side into plants, or it would transformation side into E-Heroes. And in Edison Format, what do you know? Like, the 2 main Frog variants are either Frogs plus plants, or Frogs plus E-Heroes. So basically, playing this deck, or the E-Hero version, is like playing a Shining Darkness style deck in Edison Format. It is just dramatically more powerful than everything else in the format. Now, does that mean that, it's the only deck that can win, that it's like a tier 0 format where it's just going to devolve into Frog Mirrors? No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that because of how powerful this deck is, and how much it resembles sort of the modern Yu-Gi-Oh playstyle, you end up with an Edison Format that is very different than the way Edison Format was in actual 2010. And that's kind of the issue with just playing past formats in general, is that with the benefit of hindsight, we often create decks that are way more powerful, way more broken, way less fun than the format actually was when we played it back then. With this deck, by the way, I pretty much beat Blackwings like almost every time I played them, but that's because, in my opinion, the Blackwing decks are just really unoptimized for a meta that is very combo heavy. So I'll show you my Blackwing build. I did play it a few times in ladder. This is what I played. Really, there's 2 main differences between this and the other builds that Blackwings people are playing. And it's that I main 2 Oppression and 2 DD Crow. That's like the only difference. Other than that, the deck's just standard. Royal Oppression, in my opinion, it's crazy that I see most lists only playing 1 of this card. Because it's so ridiculously good that to me it's just crazy not to play it. Not to play the max number of copies. This card was banned for a reason, guys. I've also noticed, for whatever reason, on ladder, Blackwing players seem to misplay a lot more than most other players in Edison Format, and I don't know why that is, but I think it leads them to make suboptimal choices like not playing 2 Royal Oppression, because some Blackwing players aren't aware that Oppression can't stop your Vayu, and they aren't aware that Oppression plus Whirlwind allows you to get a trigger on Blizzard without Oppression being able to negate its effect. And I've seen players not realize that several times when they're playing Blackwings. I think if people realize like how good Oppression was versus the meta and how little it disrupts Blackwing's game plan, sure, it stops you from special summoning Dark Armed, which is really good, but versus most of the decks in the format, if you just have an Oppression in play, you just can't lose. DD Crow is another thing that I think should be mained. Like, you can Allure of Darkness it away, you can Icarus attack it away, and yeah, it's not amazing versus every deck in the format, but like Oppression and DD Crow, they're just never completely dead. Oppression is obviously the better card, but DD Crow is the card that can sometimes be a lot harder to play around. Like with Quick Draw, a lot of times I'll Avarice and go like, oh goddamn, I hope they don't have a DD Crow here. And most of the times they just don't have it. DD Crow, it's good versus any Frog variant. It's even decent in the mirror. Like a lot of times just being able to counter their Blizzard, counter their Vayu can be really clutch. Sometimes I just have 2 Darks in my grave. I'll just randomly discard a DD Crow so I can summon my Dark Armed. I feel like versus every deck, you get some value out of DD Crow. Versus more than half of the meta, if it's in your side, you're just going to side it in. So you might as well just main it and then have extra room in your side deck. But I don't really want to talk too much about Blackwings. I will go back to the Frog deck. Gores and Trigodia are both very good. You know, Tragodia is often 3,000 attack or more. Gores can turn around the game. We've got a mini light sword and engine. You know, we've got charge. Maybe we're going to charge for Lila to kill an oppression. Raikou is not as strong as you might think it is. One of my hot takes on Edison Format is I think Vayu Turbo is just like tier 2 at best because it's just too slow. Like Raikou is too slow, and your sort of card advantage engine of making, you know, free things with Vayu, it's like you're just making vanilla monsters. And the problem is that that's not a very strong thing to be doing, and the deck doesn't really disrupt the other combo decks as well. So it doesn't like really fit well into the combo archetype, nor does it fit well into the camp of anti-combo decks. So yeah, you know, some of these things are optional. Do you need to play Lonefire Titanial? No, like you don't have to, but the nice thing about Lonefire is it gets you 40% of the way to getting Avarice online, and Titanial is actually pretty good at protecting your Dupe Frog lock. Often what I'll do is on turn 1, I'll just put 2 Dupe Frogs into play, and then on turn 2, I'll Lonefire into Titanial, and now it's like, okay, now it's going to be a lot harder for them to deal with this lock. You know, if they brain control my Dupe Frog, I'll just tribute Titanial to negate their brain control. You know, a lot of the outs are things that target. Dandelion is in general a very good card. Allows us to play Foolish Burial. 90% of the time you just Foolish for Dandy. Quick Draw, you know, how good is Quick Draw? How good is Drill Warrior? It kind of depends on the deck that your opponent's playing, because you just have so many people just playing kind of random tier 2 decks. And some of those tier 2 decks just can't really beat just Drill Warrior making 2 free tokens every turn. So this deck, basically all it's trying to do is either set up a Dupe Frog lock so your opponent can't inflict battle damage to you, or set up a Drill Warrior lock so your opponent can't inflict battle damage to you. Now, of course, there's some decks like Blackwings where they can just Bora Pierce through the tokens. That's not great, but, you know, most people aren't playing Blackwings. Versus Gladiator Beasts, yeah, they can attack tokens and get all of the tags they want, but not a lot of people are playing Gladiator Beasts. So, of course, if the meta was a lot different, maybe you go a different direction with this deck. If you go the E-Hero route, you're kind of playing a bunch of bad cards to support your game plan. It's like, oh, I'll play a random Alias, I'll play a random Ocean, or a random Bubble Man, whatever, so that you can play Future Fusion and Miracle Fusion, which, you know, I don't really like. Debris Dragon, I'll say, I have been super impressed with. Like, I think you can just cut Debris Dragon to 1 if you want. It's definitely one of the more optional cards, but it's pretty strong, right? Like, if you have a Treeborn Frog in play, you could Debris Dragon back your Dandy and then just make either the Red Dragon Archfiend or the Stardust Dragon. In 2010, Debris Dragon was almost exclusively used to make Black Rose, but I find myself actually not making Black Rose a lot with this card. You mostly just make either Stardust or Red Dragon. And, you know, these sort of other cards here are optional. Cyber Valley, it ironically enough kind of goes in that camp of like, it's basically always a +1, but it's not very good. It really isn't. You know, pretty much all the time you're just going to Cyber Valley a Dandelion token, which is effectively a +1. You might even Cyber Valley your Treeborn Frog with the second Treeborn Frog in your grave, which is also effectively a +1. You might Econ take your opponent's monster and go Cyber Valley, which is also a +1. But even though Cyber Valley is basically just a +1 every single time you play it, it's not that great. Basically, the only way this deck loses is if you just kind of take a bunch of battle damage out of nowhere. Battle Fader's good for stopping that. We have the other one at the side. Brain Control is kind of one of these power cards in the format that can just change the game completely, either because you go like, oh, Brain Control Substitute, or just Brain Control attack for game, whatever it may be. But in this deck, we just get to play 3 copies of Brain Control instead of 1, essentially. With this deck, you know, I did lose. I'll show you my record in a sec. I went 75-25 exactly. And pretty much all of the losses are either to one of a few things. One, it's either our opponent plays a Vanity's Fiend and we can't out it, or you just lose to other combo decks. You know, I did lose to Hero Frogs a decent amount of the time. One of my only losing matchups was the deck that people call Dragon Turbo, you know, the Dragon Draw deck with Super Rejuvenation. I think that deck is actually really strong. It's probably even like one of the best. I mean, it's easily one of the best 5 decks in the format. It's just a question of like, is it the 3rd best deck, the 2nd best deck? So that's really all this deck loses to. You just either lose to other combo decks or a deck that sticks a floodgate into play that you can't out, whether it's Vanity's Fiend, Royal Oppression, whatever. Now, post-side, you know, we do have some outs to that. Lightning Vortex is basically just there to out Vanity's Fiend. You side it in for, like, Hero Frogs and things like that. If your opponent has, say they have, like, a Vanity's Fiend in play, and you go Vortex, discard Dandy, the Vortex will resolve, kill the Vanity's Fiend, and you'll still get 2 tokens. If your opponent has an Absolute Zero in play, and you go Vortex, discard Dandy. Well, the Dandy was triggered first, so that'll be Chainlink 1. The Absolute Zero was triggered second, so that'll be Chainlink 2. And the Absolute Zero will resolve, wipe your board, and then Dandy will special summon 2 tokens. So in either of those cases, you'll still get Dandy tokens. Now, one of the main reasons why I like this deck over Hero Frogs is the fact that Super Polymerization exists. If this card didn't exist, I think there's a decent case that Hero Frogs are better. But the problem is, like, with Super Poly, basically just any monster, hey, they have like an Absolute Zero and a random monster in play. It might even be that they have like a lock. It might even be, oh, they've got a Dupe Frog in play and an Absolute Zero. I could just go, okay, I'll Super Poly away your Dupe Frog and your Absolute Zero, make my own Absolute Zero. Your Absolute Zero kills my Absolute Zero, which then kills your whole board. And the existence of Super Poly, also one of the main reasons why I think Hero Beat should just not really be a top tier deck. You might think on paper, like, oh, they've got a bunch of Gemini Sparks and Hero Blast, they can maybe deal with some of our things and beat us, but all I need is, oh, you have an Alias in play? Okay, I'll bring back my Treeborn Frog, Super Poly, make Absolute Zero. You know, you can't chain like a Gemini Spark in response because Super Poly is spell speed 4, and they have a hard time dealing with that. I'm going to show you some gameplay, and after talking shit about Edison, I'll say some good things about Edison, right? So we're transitioning to the what I like about Edison stage of the video. Now, what do I like about Edison Format, and why does it show the flaws in Goat Format? Well, it's not the game mechanics, right? It's not that the gameplay is necessarily better, more enjoyable, more strategic. What is so good about Edison Format, in my mind, is the community. And I mean that in the sense that, yeah, like on ladder, I played 100 matches. Were there a couple of assholes, you know, sprinkled in? Yeah, there were a couple, but it is far less than playing on Goat Format ladder. And I don't necessarily know why that is. I mean, I have some guesses, but, you know, generally speaking, the people were just more decent people. And you know, I would say it has to do a lot with the culture. I think in some ways it's less of a flaw of Edison, or not a flaw of Edison Format. It's less of something good about Edison Format, and it's more of a flaw of Goat Format. And I mean that in the sense that, you know, Goat Format, the people who sort of started Goat Format and really put it on the map and made it popular were from a certain community. And I mean that in the sense that the Goat Format community kind of started as an offshoot of Duelist Grounds, which I think had a lot of cultural issues. I've talked about that a little bit before. And, you know, you have these very hyper-competitive, very arrogant to a fault type people. And, you know, those people often aren't fun to be around. And I think the community often doesn't want to talk about the fact that that is an issue. And I don't see that issue as much in Edison Format because I think it sort of started with a different crowd. You know, part of it also, I think, has to do with the prize support. I, of course, have always been an advocate for more prize support in gaming. But I think that there are disadvantages to that prize support that people don't want to acknowledge. And one is that I think once people start to think of games as not really just games, but as this really serious hobby or even as something that people might do for a side income, I think that that can create a toxic behavior. And that toxic behavior, I think, is to some extent prevalent in Goat Format, and, you know, I think that's a problem. And, you know, I'm not saying that we solve this by having less prize support. I think really the solution is just the community needs to acknowledge the problem and police it more. You know, one of the things that I've been an advocate of is having really harsh penalties on people who cheat. And, you know, some people are not in favor of that. They believe in sort of second chances. To me, it's kind of all situational. It kind of depends. But, you know, I'm for an advocate of if there is a community member who is being very toxic in one way or another, the community needs to deal with that rather than just ignore the problem. Because you might think, okay, well, if I kick this toxic member out of the community, that's one less person in our community. That hurts, the long-term growth of the format, whatever. But, if you have one toxic person in your community that makes, say 10 people leave your community, well, obviously kicking one person out is better than 10 people leaving. So yeah, I have been kind of an advocate of treating the Goat Format community like a community and less like sort of a competitive environment. In the sense that, I think the priorities should be to, again, kind of create that enjoyable gameplay experience for people rather than focus on, having the best tournaments, having the most prize support, whatever. It's not that you can't do both, per se. It's, just kind of about, where your priorities lie. And what I've liked about Edison Format is that, sometimes people can be, unsure about rulings and things like that, but it's easy to look up. And in Edison Format, I feel like when there's been a ruling disagreement, one person just looks up the ruling and the other person goes, oh, okay, great. Whereas on the Goat Format letter, I have people that are just very toxic and very vindictive when there's really any sort of disagreement. I have times where I know I'm right about some Goat Format ruling, I look it up, I show it to my opponent, and I feel like a lot of the times one of two things happens. One is either my opponent refuses to believe the ruling, we call a judge, there's no judge online, and eventually my opponent will just quit, after maybe 20 minutes of waiting for a judge. Which, is fine, I guess, but that's not the result that I want when I go to play a game of Goat Format. And sometimes people will just get very angry, almost in the way that, I look up the ruling, they know they're wrong, and they just kind of say, fuck you, and leave. I've literally had opponents do that. Whereas in Edison, that just hasn't ever happened. We just look up the ruling, we realize who's right, and then that's just kind of it, we just play under the correct ruling, go on with our life. So again, whether it's just sort of cheating or, toxic behavior in general, I feel like as a community, we need to weed that out and, sort of set a good example, treat other people kindly, because that is what is best for the community as a whole and is for you individually. What I've tried to teach people, and, I think sometimes the message doesn't get across well, but if you want to compete with people, if you want to be that competitive player, there needs to actually be people for you to compete with, right? That's sort of common sense, but I feel like people are so selfish and kind of have this attitude of oh, who cares about these noobs? I don't need to do that, whatever. Rather than realizing that it's sort of a symbiotic relationship, right? In the sense that, if you want to be a competitive player, maybe make some side income playing this game, whatever, the more people that play, the more you get to do that, right? It's almost like, a pyramid in the way, not a pyramid scheme, but it's like a pyramid in the sense that, in order to make money being the best, there has to be people under you that aren't the best. And by not really treating those people well, you encourage them to leave, and that kind of wrecks the whole system. And I think sort of that focus on creating competition without regard to the newer players is kind of why growth in Goat Format has stalled over, say, the last year. Not that there's some sort of crisis, everyone's going to stop playing Goat Format tomorrow, but as of now, Edison Format Ladder is more than twice as popular as Goat Format Ladder, and, part of it might be that, hey, people like the gameplay better, but I think a big part of it is the fact that people like the experience better. The actual human interaction aspect of it is a lot more enjoyable. And the great news for Goat Format players is, if you have the opinion that I have, which is that, hey, Goat Format has better gameplay, whereas Edison Format has a better community, one of those two problems is a lot easier to fix than the other, right? Goat Format can very easily take the approach that Edison Format players take, which is, hey, I'm going to treat my opponent respectfully. I am going to, not be an asshole when there's some sort of disagreement. We can easily do that. Whereas Edison Format can't really just say to themselves, hey, our community is great, but, the mechanics aren't as fun, so let's try to have Goat Format gameplay in Edison Format, right? So you can't change the rules of the game. You can't change what cards are legal in the format, but you can change how you treat each other as human beings. And, I'll even say, I know in the past, I, of course, was part of that toxic community. I didn't always treat people well. I know to some extent, people will say, like, oh, Alan, you're a hypocrite. You treat people like shit, too. I've tried to get better over the years, right? No one's perfect, but, I try to treat my opponents with respect. And just at the end of the day, try to remember that, hey, guys, it's just a game, It's just a game. We're doing this to have fun. And, most things that we do to have fun, we do for the social aspect, actually. I was having a conversation with my fiance the other day where we went to play mini golf, and she was kind of in a bad mood and really didn't talk to me. And I sort of said to her, I was like, hey, if you're in a bad mood, why did we go play mini golf, right? And she's like, well, I thought you wanted to play mini golf. And I was like, no, I don't want to play mini golf. I want to spend time with you. I want to connect with you. And I feel like, although obviously I'm not engaged to any of my Edison Format opponents or Goat Format opponents, I feel like it's kind of the same thing. Like, yes, we, of course, like the gameplay. We want to have a game that we enjoy, but a big part of why we enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that we enjoy the time that we spend with people. And, that is why I think the human component of competition is really just so important. People like to underplay that, I think, particularly the super competitive people. They're like, oh, it's all about sort of making sure that the game is super skillful and has the best prize support and all that. And it's like, yeah, that stuff is important, but like, really, the experience is what comes first. And, I know with online play as opposed to IRL play, you get less of that human experience and more of the toxicity. But, I think if you're someone who is a leader in an online gaming community, you should try to do your best, of course, to make sure that people aren't toxic, make sure that people treat each other decently. So yeah, that is why I truly think, Edison Format is in many ways a better format than Goat Format. And it's why I think that Goat Format has problems that can be fixed. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed my my take on this matter. And, I hope you guys have great games, whether you're playing Edison Format or Goat Format. I'm not going to hate on you for your choice of format, so to speak. That is totally up to you.